Hello and welcome to Africa Amplified, Bloomberg's monthly show bringing the continent's biggest stories to the world. I'm Joanna Versace in Dubai, in for Jennifer Zabazaja this week. Now, in the spotlight this month, the Mpox outbreak and how a preventable virus became a global threat. More than 19,000 cases, both confirmed and suspected, and 638 deaths have been reported this year in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the epicenter of the crisis. Now, 4 out of 5 deaths have been in children. The variant has also been found in Burundi, Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, Sweden, and Thailand. We'll look at how missteps and inaction have allowed the virus to mutate into a strain that's spreading more easily between humans, and why it is taking so long for shots to be rolled out to the countries that need them, despite the availability of an effective vaccine. Also coming up, we'll take a closer look at Africa's relationship with China after President Xi welcomed leaders to Beijing this week. China has poured billions into infrastructure projects, giving it unparalleled influence and access to resources. We'll explore the future path of relations with the continent's dominant foreign economic power. But first, an update on some of the top stories we're following from across the continent. We'll have the latest from Harare in the south and Kigali in the east, but let's start with news out of West Africa. Nigeria, one of Africa's largest oil producers, which up to now has imported all of its refined oil products, says the new multi-billion-dollar Dangote refinery will start distributing gasoline by the end of this weekend. It is a landmark moment with the potential to transform the global market for the fuel. For more, let's bring in our Nigeria Bureau Chief, Anthony Osei-Brown in Lagos. Good morning to you, Anthony. First of all, how long is it going to take until the refinery that we spoke about is going to be running near capacity? And what implications is this going to have on the domestic fuel market?
Yeah, the first impact is going to have is improved supply. Right now, Nigeria is in the midst of an acute scarcity. There are long queues at fuel stations, basically because the main supplier, the state-owned Nigerian National Petroleum Company, has not been able to supply enough fuel for the country. And so long lines, people are spending hours and hours at the fuel stations unable to get fuel. So Dangote coming in, hopefully by the weekend, when they expect to start distributing petroleum products across the country, will immediately improve supply and possibly get people out of the long queues at the fuel stations. And at full capacity, has enough fuel to meet Nigeria's needs and even export their effect. So that's what we are hoping it happens as soon as they start selling into the Nigerian market. Yeah.
Well, the country's state oil company has said its ability to supply gasoline is being disrupted. What impact has this had on everyday Nigerians?
Yeah, the immediate impact is that all Nigerians are lining up currently. If you come into the country, you see long queues at the fuel stations. People are spending 24 hours at the fuel station just to try and be able to fill their cars. It has disrupted businesses. Businesses are not able to operate because both staff are home or struggling to get to the office, and they often get into the office late. Businesses are discussing remote working just because people are not able to get into the office when they should get into the office. Transport fares have more than doubled. So yeah, the state oil company has been selling fuel cheap to people by subsidizing it. It builds up a debt of over $6 billion, and it on Sunday or Monday admitted that it is struggling to pay this debt. That's why it's affecting supply. So Dangote is just coming in at the right time. That will help reduce some of the stresses on the economy.
Yeah, certainly appears to be the case. Anthony, thank you for bringing us that report. Anthony Osei-Brown in Lagos. Well, to Southern Africa now, where relief could be on the way for nations battling the fallout from a record El Nino-induced drought. Better rainfall is forecast for the central part of the region, which covers Botswana, central Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. The worst dry spell in more than a century has led to livestock deaths, a corn shortfall of at least 3 million tons, and higher food inflation. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Ray Ndlovu, who is in the Zimbabwean capital, Harare. So, Ray, just put it into context for us. How severe has this drought been, and which nations have been the hardest hit?
Well, thank you, Jumana. So the drought has been very severe because we've seen livestock dying primarily as a result of stress from the lack of water. We've seen also corn output. Corn is a staple here in Southern Africa. That is plunged, as you rightly pointed out, by about 3 million tons. So several Southern African countries have had to import corn to supplement food supplies. Some of the countries that are affected, particularly Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. We've seen also devastation in Botswana and Namibia. In the case of Namibia, wildlife as well has been affected, and that country is planning to cull some animals and to feed the human population. So really the devastation has cut across different segments of life across the Southern African region.
Ray, what have these countries done to mitigate the impact and also potentially future-proof their countries and their economies for further incidents of droughts in the future?
Well, most of these countries now are looking to diversify in terms of the seeds that they are using to grow corn. They're trying to get some drought-resistant seed to be able to rely on that to reduce the effect of being hit by droughts, because there have been several droughts over the region over the last couple of years, and particularly as well. They're trying to move away from dependence on hydropower. In the case of Zambia and Zimbabwe, they rely on a lake, one of the world's biggest man-made reservoirs, Lake Kariba, to draw power from there. So that power source as well is being impacted because of the drought. So the countries themselves are now beginning to look at solar power as a way, out of reliance on hydropower, because that's prone to a lot of of the impact of the El Nino-induced drought. And also, you're looking at countries beginning to invest as well in grain and making sure that they've got enough food reserves going into seasons, in case they have a shortfall in the coming season. So we're seeing different mitigation strategies being sort of like worked on and being put together by the different nations.
Yeah. Bloomberg's Ray Ndlovu in Harare, thank you so much for bringing us that report. Now to the east, where the risk of renewed conflict in the Horn of Africa region has been rising this year. Landlocked Ethiopia is embroiled in a dispute with neighbor Somalia due to its attempts to gain direct access to the Red Sea. The spat has dragged other nearby countries into it, including Djibouti. Now, stuck in the middle, the small nation has offered Addis Ababa exclusive access to one of its ports in order to reduce regional tensions. We spoke to the Foreign Affairs Minister on the sidelines of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing.
The African problems should be first, handled by the African nations. That's, a core principle in the Charter of the African Union. IGAD is trying its best. You have mentioned the tension between Somalia and Ethiopia. IGAD is stepping forward. Djibouti is heading, IGAD organization. That's why Djibouti put forward, let's say, compromise to Ethiopia.
Have you offered that plan
yes.
to Ethiopia?
Yes.
And what is their response?
We're expecting a positive response soon.
Bloomberg's Ondiro Ganga joins us from Kigali, Rwanda. Well, we talked about Djibouti. We just heard from the Djibouti foreign minister there having to intervene. But talk us through the steps that got us to that point. What escalated the tension that prompted Djibouti to step in?
Jumana, Ethiopia lost its port access in 1991 when Eritrea gained independence, and Ethiopia has been forced to rely on Djibouti for 90% of their international trade. This has been a pain point when it comes to trade, when it comes to economic activities, and even security. And because of this missed opportunity, Ethiopia went ahead to sign a deal with Somaliland that grants them port access for economic activities and to build a naval base for 50 years. And this is what sparked the diplomatic row, because in exchange, Ethiopia was going to recognize them as a sovereign state. That has sparked tension because Somaliland is a semi-autonomous region of Somali, and though it's more stable, they have their own elections and own currency, they are yet to be recognized internationally by any other country. And so this sparked a lot of anger in Somali, who say that Ethiopia recognizing Somaliland will be an act of aggression towards their territorial integrity.
And why is this important for the proposal to go through and an amicable resolution to be reached soon?
Jumana, it's important because already the Horn of Africa is a volatile region and both parties are not helping the situation. Ethiopia began escalating by refusing to refer to Somali by its name and instead resorted to using coordinates on their national carriers, something that angered Somali. They sent a cease and desist and also threatened to ban their flights. On the other hand, Somali is not helping the situation. They've signed a pact with Egypt on security and they're getting military-grade weapons and also training, which is a provocative move. So Djibouti is stepping in to try and ease the tension, mediate, and offering Ethiopia this port in the hopes that it will calm the tension in the region. Ethiopia is responding positively, but there'll only be a sigh of relief once ink is put on paper.
Andira Ganga and Kigali, thank you so much. Well, coming up, as Mpox spreads, we'll bring you the latest on efforts to contain the outbreak as the first delivery of doses arrives in the DRC. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
To ramp up really takes a shift in resources and capabilities. We're looking at doing that. We can do that. That's how we will be able to deliver the 2 million doses. But really, we really need orders before we can move.
The CEO of Bavarian Nordic there on plans to ramp up production of the only Mpox jab approved by both U.S. and European regulators. Meanwhile, African manufacturers are also preparing to make Mpox shots. The Biovac Institute, a South African vaccine maker, is able to produce the jabs and is waiting for more discussions with companies, including Bavarian Nordic.
The two manufacturers of Mpox, do they have sufficient capacity to manufacture for the next coming years? So there's 10 million doses that's been spoken about publicly. And so are those manufacturers able to meet the world's current demand? If they are, then it means that they may not need an African manufacturer. However, if we think that they are either unable or unwilling, then that's where I think the likes of ourselves can come in. But what we would like to understand is that will there be an annual demand of the vaccine? Now, that annual demand can come in two forms. Either there can be an annual demand that says that we'll produce the vaccine, Biovac, and we know the arms that it will go into, and they'll have some preventive program, or produce the vaccine and for stockpiling. Now, if there's a long-term stockpiling effort, and we know that there's a predictable demand from a stockpiling perspective, that can potentially make it more viable.
Biovac CEO Marina Maguana speaking to Bloomberg on the viability of an Mpox vaccine made in Africa. In the meantime, the DRC is set to deploy vaccines this weekend that were delivered by the European Commission's Health Emergency Unit. For more details, Janice Q, our healthcare reporter in Johannesburg, joins us now. Well, Janice, it seems like it's taken longer than hoped for these vaccines to arrive in Congo. Why is that? Why the delay?
Sourcing vaccines is a complicated process. First, you have to actually find out where they are and who's manufacturing them and if they've got the quantities you need. But then you've got to fund them, and you've also got to have a really solid plan of ensuring that once they've hit the ground, you can actually get the shots into arms. This might require some extra medical training because different shots are delivered in different ways. It's also ensuring that there's the cold chain that's needed to make sure that the vaccines are kept safe and effective. And you've got to really engage in community, with the communities involved. You know, you've got to make sure that they're comfortable with coming in to get these shots. So it's not a simple process, but it has taken longer. Arguably, you know, Africa should have had these vaccines back in 23 when, or even 22, when the last Mpox outbreak was declared a public health emergency.
Not enough attention was paid at the time. But now that the vaccines are arriving, are we likely to see the outbreak get under control?
It should certainly help. The World Health Organization Director General this week said, though, that vaccines alone aren't going to solve the issue. The World Health Organization and Africa CDC today will release a response plan that will tackle things like weak surveillance and you know, making sure that there is good clinical and home care, addressing some of these bigger issues, and that is really what's going to control things. I mean, back in 2022 and 23, with the less virulent strain that was circulating globally at that time, things really turned around when communities were engaged and they figured out what the main modes of transmission were, what was causing the spread, and when the community came in and changed behavior. So all of these things are going to be necessary. It's not the vaccines alone.
And what are some of the longer-term, say, bigger issues that are also being considered in terms of this vaccine deployment?
One of the big things is going to be price. This vaccine is not cheap. At about $141 a dose, if you were to vaccinate 5 million people in the Congo, you're looking at about $1 billion. And that is not something many countries in Africa can afford. It is a supply and demand issue as well. So one of the other conversations that are going to be needed to be had is what is the vaccine strategy longer term? You know, are Mpox vaccines going to become part of routine vaccination programs? That would secure demand. And as we heard from Biovac, you know, when we get demand secured, then these issues can be considered in a more robust way. Funding to make sure that there is local manufacturing. These are issues that were raised during COVID and are still very relevant for a multitude of health issues on the continent. You know, these countries are having to make really tough decisions about trade-offs at a price of about $141 a dose, and this is a 2-dose vaccination program. You know, you've got to ask questions. Are you still going to be able to cover things like malaria and cholera and meningitis? The DRC is not just dealing with an Mpox outbreak; they are dealing with an extremely big problem with cholera. 23,500 cases this year alone of cholera in the DRC. So these are tough questions that have to be asked.
Yeah, and it's not just a health question, but also one of money and financing. So very valid points you bring up there. Thank you, Janice Q, our healthcare reporter in Johannesburg. Well, coming up, China's president uses a summit with African leaders to cement relations with the continent. But will accusations of debt traps and concerns over China's economy test that relationship? We'll explore that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Africa Amplified with me, Jumana Bersachi in Dubai, in for Jennifer Zabazaja this month. China's relationship with the continent has been in focus this week as President Xi Jinping woos African leaders at a summit aimed at deepening ties. The Chinese leader has vowed to upgrade diplomatic relations and offered a range of economic perks to the continent. That is despite China's slowing growth, limiting its ability to lend. President Xi has pledged to provide Africa with $50 billion in financial support over the next 3 years and strengthen military cooperation with the region, seen as key to his geopolitical ambitions. And they're covering it all for us. Bloomberg's chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, has been at the summit and joins us now. Well, Stephen, African leaders have been receiving the red carpet treatment this week in Beijing. Why is the African continent so important to China strategically?
Oh, it is very important geopolitically and economically, as we've seen. It's been a hallmark of Xi Jinping's last essentially a decade or 11 years in office as president. He has put this as a priority. You and I discussed about it. Xi Jinping has been to Africa 5 times over that last decade. Joe Biden and Donald Trump over the past 8 years of U.S. presidency have not been to Africa at all. So Xi Jinping clearly sees a strategic move in courting Africa. And the last 3 days actually has been sort of a charm offensive. I mean, China cannot necessarily, given its struggling economy and also poor returns on past lending, they can't necessarily open up their checkbook as wide as before. But they're offering, including today, Premier Li Qiang at a business summit, the 3rd day of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, essentially offered a bunch of sweeteners to African nations, including offering duty-free access on African products into the Chinese market for at least 33 African nations, those nations who have been deemed to have developed economies. So that is a sweetener. Basically, we all know that China wants to go and invest in key strategic areas and reap the benefits of the energy and raw materials and precious metals from the likes of South Africa, but also the African nations who are faced with a record trade deficit with China of $64 billion last year. They need to have market access into China, perhaps the biggest consumer market in the world. So they're offering these sweeteners. We'll have to see, though, how it comes to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the fact that the Chinese economy has started to slow down. That's not a surprise for anyone to hear. But in the past, China's been accused of debt trapping. How has the financial support that's coming through for Africa evolving?
Yes, I think the Chinese are getting a little smarter at where and what to invest in or to extend loans to, and also expect a little more transparency on the returns on that investment. So they're going to also invest in green infrastructure. That is a hallmark as well of Xi Jinping. We all know about the excess capacity, industrial capacity in China, in particular in EVs, in batteries, in solar panels. One area that China would like to see and develop further is those export markets in Africa. But they will also have to build and extend loans to that kind of infrastructure across the continent. So you're going to see a little bit more strategic investment by the Chinese into areas that they can also see a more tangible return.
Stephen Engel, thank you so much for the reporting, Bloomberg's Chief North Asia correspondent. And that's all we have time for today. Join us again next month. From me, Jumana Bersachi in Dubai, it is goodbye.